So I sort of started my fund too early and stuff like that. But I think that I wouldn't change a lot in the sense that when you have a fund, you learn more about your industry. If you do it right, I think you learn more about your industry than any other sort of job other than actually being in that industry. So you learn a ton about what Wall Street wants. So let's say if you're a software analyst, it's really great to then have a software company because you know exactly kind of what the exit looks like and what like public company investors want to see. And the same thing works in biotech. And in biotech, to handicap like, oh, will this company or stock be a good stock? Well, you got to figure out, will this drug be a good drug? And that's the exact same skill set you have to do when you're CEO. So you have that like, crossover that's happening quite a bit more in biotech. I've seen that, it doesn't happen so much in tech. People who invest in tech generally don't want to be operators. And the tricks that you have to learn on the operating side in tech are very different from biotech. In biotech, you can actually like pick up most of the operating stuff from being an investor. Whereas I think in tech, like, being an investor in a software company certainly doesn't make you a programmer. So,
and that's what I was going to ask you because you were like, well, I started a pharmaceutical company because I loved the asset and I learned through it for finance, which is way different than like, for example, my friend Kara started this company Hint, which does like water because she was like, my skin was bad and I didn't want to drink Gatorade or Coke anymore. So I like went and boiled fruit peels and made this fruit water that's like tastes good. It's good for you. And we grew from there. Your founding story was like, oh, I found assets that were interesting. Like that's like foreign to me. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So like if there was a company, for example, my first hedge fund, we bought 10% of this company, publicly traded company, and they had bought this asset from Bristol Myers, the major drug company in New Jersey. And Bristol Myers spent like $50 million developing this drug and they quit. They basically said, this doesn't fit our portfolio. We're not really going after the disease they were trying to go after was hypertension, which is very boring and does not need another medicine. There's like 60 hypertension drugs, there does not need to be a 61st. And they just quit on the drug. There are people who have like really bad resistant hypertension and so forth. So I really like this asset. I like the way it worked. And after Bristol Myers quit on it, the publicly traded company in the financial crisis, they merged with another publicly traded company. So I went to the publicly traded company. And again, only thing I have is a hedge fund moment. And I said, let me buy. And nobody's told a story, by the way. So this is a good time to tell it because it's a really, it's basically a story about how we went to this company with $2 million and turned it into over $1 billion. Which is kind of remarkable, but people do this in pharma every day. And my friend, and at the time it was actually my biggest investor, Vivek Ramaswamy, he's now running for president. He basically took our business model and supersized it. And again, who influenced who is a matter, left to history. But the point is we went to this company that had the license from Bristol and they weren't doing anything with it. And we said, listen, we'll take this, we'll find investors, we'll build a company around it. And I'm going to figure out how to make this work. And they said, okay, sure. We got this asset sitting here doing nothing. If you pay us $2 million, we'll send you the $2 million. Now we sent them $1 million, which was really catastrophic because you never want to sort of go back on your word. But it was really like a dire circumstance where I forgot what happened exactly, but we just couldn't come up with money. And it was like, we sent them $1 million and they were like, what the fuck? You can't do this, and I was sort of like, geez, this is a huge embarrassment and a huge problem, but you're just going to have to give us like 30 days or 90 days. And, we worked it out and we were able to give them the second $1 million, but it was like this colossal embarrassment right at the start. And, shit does happen, but, it ideally shouldn't happen like that. And again, really embarrassing and tough, but we got them the $2 million. And we decided, I sort of did all this research and said, instead of hypertension, we should go with this rare kidney disease called focal segmental glomerulosclerosis. And if you just go on PubMed and you have the willpower, you can learn a lot about medicine and you can dive in and really
PubMed just being like a database of articles.
Yeah, PubMed is
patents, I guess.
Yep, PubMed is the government database of all scholastic biomedical literature. So 36 million papers. If you sit there long enough and you have the passion, you can become a billionaire. It's just a matter of sitting there and sifting and sifting and sifting, which most people don't have the patience, desire, or willpower to do. But every single biomedical innovation is logged in on PubMed.
And you were sifting for what? What were you looking for when you went on PubMed?
Yeah, you have to put the pieces together. So this drug was an endothelin receptor antagonist. And what does that mean? It inhibits a protein called endothelin and its function. Well, what will that do, right? You have to decide, you have to learn, where is endothelin expressed in the body? How does it work? What does it do? If I stop endothelin from working, what benefits will that have? What problems will that result in? And you have to look at the history of, okay, well, other companies have tried this. What have they seen? What have they discovered? And what's interesting about pharma is that you think that these companies cover the waterfront, but they really just prod and poke a little bit. There's actually probably 10 diseases that this drug could be beneficial for. And I made a list of those and I said, okay, well, which one of these is going to work for sure? And there are companies that like got half the answer and stuff like that. And you just have to keep poking. And we found like these handful of diseases that really made a lot of sense. Now, the problem was nobody in Wall Street really liked it. It was very, kind of early, there was this sort of tough problem of if you reduce the amount of protein in the urine of a patient, does that really save their kidney? And I thought I convinced everyone that I could reduce the amount of protein in the urine, which was a very big endpoint to me, but not as conclusive as, okay, am I saving their lives? Am I preventing dialysis and kidney failure, which is really the so-called hard endpoint. So I had the soft endpoint that like seemed like almost certain I was right. And I was starting to convince companies like AbbVie and Biotech and other like big biopharmas that, I was onto something, but nobody wanted to write a check, so I basically got one of the management teams that I used to deal with on Wall Street to invest. And I slowly kind of cobbled together some money, met folks like Peter Thiel and others to try to sort of get some investors, did a reverse merger.
What's Peter Thiel like?
Peter was great. It was 10 plus years ago. He had never done pharma. So we got to meet, and this was going to be basically like his first pharma deal ever. We didn't end up doing the deal, but it was a very funny thing because like there was this East Coast versus West Coast mentality. As a Wall Street guy, he was, he's obviously, one of the top VC type guys. And this is a time where like he had Clarium, their founders fund was just getting started and stuff like that. And, the wheeling dealing like Wall Street sort of style of like, oh, we're going to do a reverse merger, which is basically kind of like a SPAC with no money. It's like even worse than a SPAC. You do the listing and then you raise the money. But it's a way to go public, and we did it. And he was like, you can't go public in a year or two. And, the reality is you kind of can, especially in biopharma, where the assets are like these very modular systems. They're not like a base business that has X dollars revenue and is growing at X rate. These are like, okay, this asset's worth something dead or alive. In other words, if it's being developed or not being developed, it's worth something. Especially with the right business plan, it could be worth a lot. So anyway, we decided to go public. We raised some money. We started doing clinical trials. The trial worked, and the rest is history. But it took, it takes hundreds of millions of dollars to develop a drug. Again, the value of the company is 1.5. The value of that drug specifically is probably around 1 billion. Again, whether it actually achieves the sales goals or beats them or disappoints, we'll see as the drug launches. And I'm rooting for the company. So you didn't even get the drug in this example. You didn't get the drug to the point where people were buying it or using it. It was, you made money off just the fact that this will exist hopefully in 10 or whatever years. Yeah. And this is where, a lot of people don't know my story about medicine. A lot of people think that I take medicines and raise prices. Well, this drug was barely in human beings. It had been in like 30 or 50 people up until that point. And, I made most of my money in sort of developments in pharma on the research side. So, this is a drug in clinical research. So no, it's not, it hadn't been FDA approved. It would take 10 years to get it FDA approved. So it was a long marathon of running studies, getting the evidence, running more studies, getting more evidence, and continuing that process. And, as we started to do that, the value of the company increased and people said, okay, I think I get this. And then as the data came in, now it's FDA approved. It's called Filspari. I named the drug sparsentan, gave it its first chemical name. And, I'm so happy it's FDA approved. Now I left the company halfway through this process, so I should acknowledge that. But, all the same plans and so forth, continued.
Did you own most of it at the time, or what was that? And did you have to divest when all the shit went down?
So I went from 90, when we started it, to 50. When we're public, I think we had around 40 or 50% after our first financing, down to 30, after our second financing, down to 20. So at the time of our IPO, when you do a reverse merger, you often don't get on NASDAQ. So we did an IPO on NASDAQ in 2014, and the company was worth like 300 or 400 million, and I owned about 15, 20% of it. And again, this is sort of like my first wealth ever. But the funny thing is, as you guys maybe know, you have a situation like that, you actually don't have any cash.
Yeah, you're not liquid.
Yeah, you can't sell it.
So, I've got millions of shares of the stock, but, I'm sitting there saying, okay, well,
You're like, how am I
do I
going to buy
want
this
this?
Wu-Tang album?
Yeah, exactly. Well, but well before that, you think about like, how am I going to buy this $5,000 a month apartment and go to the $7,000 a month apartment,
Yeah.
which is like a very funny discussion for somebody that, has 50 or $100 million of stock value. And I would go to these banks and say, listen, can I borrow 5%, of my money, of my stock value? And they would say no. And, I'd say, why not? And they'd say, well, it's a new stock, it's kind of, still, a little bit unseasoned. You're the big shareholder, we're just not comfortable with it. And it's like sitting there like, oh my God, this is insane, because I don't want to sell my stock because it sends kind of a bad signal to the market. But I don't want to, also be starving. So it was a very like funny thing. And I don't want to be one of those greedy CEOs that has, an insane salary, where you don't need it. So it was very just sort of a funny circumstance